Hello, Internet! Welcome back to another episode of the Engram. Oh, been a good time. So, what are we talking about today? So, I do want to clarify one thing before I get started on the Destiny stuff. Well, first, let me say hello to everybody who's listening to the podcast, either on gkick.net, or if you're subscribed on iTunes, or if you're watching on YouTube. Hi again. So, one of the first things that I want to talk about is the frequency of this show. Now, my initial concept was to do it once a week, but then I got to thinking, these episodes are usually really short, 10, 20 minutes or so, so I'm thinking I will do it at least once a week, but maybe more often. Just so because there's always news coming out, there's always news each week with the latest stuff that, Bungie's doing for the game. So there's always something. But I did want to at least let everybody know that that's why you're going to start seeing these shows, in irregular patterns. That's why I think there's been 3 shows this first week. But in any event, that's kind of how things are going to work going forward. But that's all I wanted to say. Now, this week, the new patch hit, which we talked about the first show. Patch 1.0.2, which made all the loot changes to the Cryptarch, which means you get a rare Engram, it's going to be rare or higher. You get a legendary, it's going to be legendary or higher. You don't have to worry about finding that legendary Engram, only to have it be a blue, and basically be all for naught. So, that's great. That's all in effect. And a few other changes have gone into effect with this patch, but that's been the big one, obviously. And really the most important one, I think. And I think that that's helped a lot of players really feel like playing the game and getting the rewards are more valuable. There's not that automatic disconnect with, oh, I did all this work, I finally got some legendary or a legendary Engram, but I know it's just going to be rare. So there's not that anymore, thankfully. But in any event, I did have one thing that I did want to talk about. So I've got a question from somebody named Gilbert Ghostfried. Weird name. Anyway, so the question comes in, and I got the message, so let's hear it.
Guardian, can you tell me, why does everybody seem to hate the story in Destiny? I played the game, I went through the campaign, it didn't look so bad. What's the deal?
Well, thank you, Gilbert Ghostfried. Let me answer that. So the story in Destiny is probably one of the most agreed upon things when it comes to Destiny. That the story, for all intents and purposes, is pretty terrible. I am here to play, I don't want to say devil's advocate because it's not necessarily a bad position, but I'm here to speak on the other side of that argument. However, I'm going to do it to a point. Let me clarify by saying I don't think that Destiny's story is good or great by any means. But what I do think is that Destiny's story in and of itself, the plot itself, is okay. It's not broken, it's not damaged. The biggest problem with the story, and I think this is something that everybody agrees on, is the presentation of it. The story is presented in such a way in the game that it feels rushed, it feels lazy, and it feels incomplete. And the fact that we have to rely so much on grimoire cards just to tell the story is just, there's no good reason for that. There's no reason for that at all. And I know that the initial thought behind it was that the story that they had was scrapped at the last second, and they didn't have the time to incorporate like a grimoire card system into the game or change it around anyway, so they had to kind of rush to get this new story in place. Now, I don't know if that's the truth. That's what a lot of people are saying. That's what a lot of rumors are saying. But the important thing is that the story in Destiny is flawed in its presentation. It's a very interesting story in the sense of there's a lot of little variables, or I should say there's a lot of points in the story where there is no definitive answer yet, and that's okay, because, you know, they've said they've got a 10-year plan for Destiny, so I don't expect this story to be able to resolve itself anytime soon, nor do I expect it to run all 10 years. What's probably going to happen is you're going to get this core story that introduces you to the game. And over the next few years, it's going to start to complete this part of the story and then introduce new story elements as we get deeper and deeper. Just like World of Warcraft, for example, told a specific story, but it kept adding on to it as we got later on. So, I'm going to try to avoid spoilers in this video, this podcast. I will probably come back with a spoiler-full episode a little later on, maybe this week, maybe next week. I don't know, but I'll do a spoiler-based story because I want to get some of your questions too. So here's the deal. First things first. If you have any questions about the plot of Destiny that you want to ask, post them in the comments below or hit me up on Twitter at @gkickshalthis. The link is in the description, or you can hit me up on my Facebook page. The link's also in the description on YouTube. So I want you to, you know, reach out if you have any questions about the plot. But to kind of summarize things, the basic element of the plot is that we as humanity found something called the Traveler, which is a small moon-like planetoid kind of thing. It's very small, no bigger than like the city that we all exist in, but it apparently contained great power, and it brought along what was called the Golden Age, which, gave everybody great power and was a huge time in the world. And then something came called the Darkness. Now, this is the first point of interest in this story, that the Darkness is a very ambiguous element, and there is no description on what the Darkness is. There's no idea. Nobody knows what the Darkness is. Nobody, even in the game world, seems to know what the Darkness is. And I think that makes it really interesting, because it seems like the overarching plot, and something that'll probably run all the way through to the very end of Destiny, is the Darkness, and the Darkness's return. So, some suspicion says that the Darkness, is an actual, tangible threat. Some say that it's more of a psychological kind of thing, where when the Darkness sets in, it starts to affect people emotionally, mentally, maybe a combination of the two. It's a very interesting point of conversation, a little like the smoke monster in the TV show Lost, that there's no explanation for it right off the bat, and I think that that's a good thing. We have this ever-looming threat that has no real explanation yet, which means, it really means two things. For one, it means that there could be something really extraordinary they can do with the concept of the Darkness. But for two, it could mean that they could fuck it up and really do something lame and terrible with it. We'll have to see what happens. But, in any event, that's the big kind of theme. We got the Traveler was there, the Darkness came, the Traveler used its power to push off the Darkness, and therefore nearly died. So I don't know right now if the Traveler is dying, dead, healing, whatever. We don't know. But the Traveler is sitting over the last city on Earth, protecting it. And that's where it created the ghosts. And ghosts are elements of itself that it sent out to find the Guardians. And Guardians are people and other types of beings who possess the power of the Traveler. So it had to find the Guardians, resurrect them, which is where the story starts in Destiny. You get resurrected by a ghost, and you start to, demonstrate your power. Now, this is where the story starts to get a little bit convoluted. And this is where I'm not really going to get into it, because this is where the game starts to unfold the story, how you as the Guardian factor in, the things you discover. One of the biggest faults, I feel, with the story itself, in addition to, I've already talked about the Grimoire card system being a really poor way of telling a game story. But what I will say is that another really big problem is the amount of things it tries to introduce in the first game. We got the Fallen, we got the Vex, we got all these different enemies, the Stranger, we finally heard the first word of Rasputin. we got so many different elements that have been introduced in this one game in what's a fairly short campaign, maybe, I don't know, 10, 12 hours. And now we have to sit on all of this and try to decipher what everything is. You know? So I think some of these elements could have been introduced in later games, different expansions, you know, and told the story a little further. But again, if the story was rushed the way everybody seems to think it is and the way it appears to have been, then I guess I can understand, you know, why it all feels the way it does, because it just feels bad. It feels poorly designed, poorly implemented, and not really a good positive. But again, what I will say is that the story itself, the actual story, isn't terrible. It's not mind-blowingly great, but it's not terrible. So here's another point that I keep hearing in opposition to the game's story, and that's the names that are used. Guardian, the Light, the Darkness. A lot of the names of the you know, characters and creatures in there are very simplistic. And I've heard a lot of feedback from people saying that the name convention is very, like, here's a term and we'll fill in the blank later kind of thing. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I like the fact that a lot of the terms that are used to describe certain things in this game are very basic. They aren't elaborate terms, because here's what we got to figure. All of the terminology that's being used are things that we have given, names that we have given to these things. And as a human race, we are very prone to give very basic, definitive names to things, especially when they define our culture. So, if we're dealing with a great power, we might call it the light. If we're dealing with a great evil, we might call it darkness. And there's also a little bit of a parallel to religion in this whole thing too. But when we're describing enemies, you know, yeah, we use terms like the Fallen and the Vex. I don't know if that's their actual names. Like, if that's what they call themselves. They may not call themselves really anything. But that's what we call them. And I think it all makes sense in that regard. So I don't see the problem with the naming convention in Destiny. It might look a little lazy on the surface, but it makes sense. So, end of the day, and I'm going to wrap it up here, the plot in Destiny is flawed, but not terrible, but it's presented in such a way that makes it really hard to immerse yourself in. Really, really hard. And I think that's the problem. Alright, I'm going to wrap it up here again. So again, leave me questions in the comment section below or on Twitter or anywhere you can reach me. If you have questions about Destiny's plot, I want to try to answer them when I get into the spoiler episode a little later on, either this week or next week or some point down the line. We'll do a spoiler episode and we'll talk about the actual details of Destiny's plot, like the actual game's plot. Anyway, I will see you all later. Let me know what you think about the episode. Did you like Gilbert Ghostfried? Do you want to hear more from him? I'm sure we can get him on the line again sometime soon. He has good questions. Anyway, that'll do it. I'll see you all next time. Farewell.